Welcome back. We will not erase black women from history. Most of us know about Dred Scott versus Sandford, the case of 1857, but it should have been Harriet and Dred Scott versus Sandford, 1857. Dred Scott was born into slavery in Southampton, Virginia around 1799 and enslaved by the same family that enslaved his parents. Scott moved with his enslavers to Alabama in 1818 and then relocated to St. Louis, Missouri in 1830. In 1832, when his first enslaver died, he was purchased by another, a Dr. John Emerson, an army surgeon. Between 1833 through 1836, Scott lived in Illinois, a free state, with his enslaver, but for some unknown reason did not claim his freedom. In 1836, Scott was taken to Fort Snelling in Wisconsin Territory. Wisconsin was a slave state. The woman who would become Scott's wife, Harriet Robinson, was born into slavery in Virginia in around 1815. In the 1830s, her enslaver broke the law by bringing her to Fort Snelling to work as an enslaved domestic worker. Fort Snelling is north of the line where the Missouri Compromise, made slavery illegal. So she should have been freed. But as a white man, they're going to wink at it. At Fort Snelling, Harriet and Dred met and married each other. They were in love. Yep, significant age difference. Though their marriage was not legally binding, a civil wedding was officiated by Scott's enslaver. Also during that time, Harriet was purchased by her husband's enslaver so that they could remain together. Yes, it's sounding like slavery light, but remember, all slavery is bad slavery. In 1837, their enslaver, Dr. Emerson, was transferred to an army base in Louisiana where he met Eliza Irene Sandford. Going forward, I'll refer to her as Irene. And she was originally from St. Louis. Irene was visiting her sister who was married to a captain at the army base, the same army base. Irene was from a pro-slavery family of enslavers who owned a plantation in St. Louis called California and had many other significant connections to slavery. They met in November 1837 and married in February of the next year. Emerson left the Scotts behind at Fort Snelling, where they were hired out and their wages taken from them. At this time, they neither attempted to escape nor claimed their freedom in their enslavers' absence. The Scotts went to Louisiana to continue to work for their enslavers. Louisiana is a slave state, you got it. Harriet was pregnant at the time of the trip, and the 1,000-mile journey, which was potentially hazardous to her health. 8 months later, when her enslaver was transferred back to Fort Snelling, Harriet returned with him, though it was near time for her to give birth. It sounds like the birth of Jesus, right? She gave birth to a daughter who she named after her mistress. She called her Eliza. Eliza was born on a steamboat called Gypsy, north of the north line of the state of Missouri on the Mississippi River. That place of birth is a non-slavery zone, so she was born free. It is unclear whether the naming of the child was by choice or at the command of her enslaver. The family remained enslaved at Fort Snelling for the next 2 years. When their enslaver was given a new assignment to the Seminole War in Florida, the war between the indigenous people and U.S. people, he sent the enslaved couple to live in St. Louis, Missouri, where slavery was legal. In St. Louis, they were forced to work for other people while their enslaver received their wages. It is believed that Harriet worked as a domestic worker and provided childcare. While in St. Louis, she gave birth to a second child, Lizzie, at a military post called Jefferson Barracks. In 1842, Scott's enslaver Emerson was discharged from the army. He returned to St. Louis, but as he was unable to sustain a private practice in the city in 1843, he moved to Davenport, Iowa, and opened a practice there. Irene joined him and gave birth to her daughter, Henrietta. Emerson died suddenly in December, a month after the birth of his daughter, at the age of 40. Medical records claim consumption as his cause of death, but it was believed that his death was the result of complications from syphilis. Upon his death, his wife Irene became the Scots' new enslaver. She sent them back to St. Louis to be hired out, and she took their wages. Dred Scott attempted to purchase his freedom from his new enslaver, but she declined. 3 years later, in 1846, with the assistance of anti-slavery lawyers, Harriet and Dred Scott filed individual lawsuits for their freedom in Missouri, based on the once free, always free precedent of the case Winnie versus Whiteside of 1824. Historians reported that the couple were not politically motivated to sue for their freedom. The grounds of their lawsuit was that they lived as residents of free states, hence freed, and now in Missouri they should remain free. Harriet and Dred Scott cases were not novel. They were one of hundreds of similar cases that had passed through the St. Louis Circuit Court, where people were allowed to sue for their freedom from wrongful enslavement. However, the political climate was volatile, with pro and anti-slavery supporters at each other's throats, and they were trying to use this case as a test case. On March 17, 1848, whether because she was broke or a parasite who did not have a way to earn her own income, or just pro-slavery, Irene had the sheriff of St. Louis take charge of the Scott family to hire them out and collect their wages until the court case was finalized. The family would remain under the control of the sheriff until March 18, 1857. Years later, the case would go on all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. In January 12, 1850, the case was decided in Harriet's and Dred's favor, but Irene asked her brother John Sandford to appeal. At the appeal, the case was combined, and Harriet Scott's name was erased from history, and we brought her back. On March 22, 1852, the Missouri Supreme Court ruled against the Scotts, and when it went to the Supreme Court of the U.S. and not the state court, they also ruled against the Scott. In 1849 or 1850, Irene found another host when she moved to Springfield, Massachusetts, and married Dr. Calvin C. Chaffee. He was an abolitionist who was elected to Congress shortly after their marriage. In February 1857, when Dr. Chaffee became aware that he, by way of his wife, because all her property was legally his, owned the most famous enslaved person in the U.S., also after having experienced nationwide, quote, disparaging commentary, unquote, for his hypocrisy, he decided to transfer ownership of the Scotts to Taylor Blow, who lived in St. Louis, because only a citizen of the state could emancipate an enslaved person. Irene, being Irene, took the money the sheriffs had saved, which was $750. Dred and Harriet were formally freed on May 26, 1857. Now we read from the account of what happened post his freedom. Dred Scott took a job as a porter at Barnum Hotel in St. Louis. He became some sort of a celebrity there. The family lived off Carr Street in the city, where Harriet took in laundry, which Scott delivered when he was not working at the hotel. Dred Scott did not live to enjoy his free status very long. On September 17, 1858, he died of tuberculosis. Their daughter, Lizzie Scott, married Wilson Madison of St. Louis, and they had two sons, Harry and John Alexander. Harriet Scott died on June 17, 1876, at the home of Lizzie and Wilson Madison. She was buried June 20th, 1876, in Section C of Greenwood Cemetery in St. Louis County. So here are the two questions that I have. Why didn't they sue for their freedom in the Free State, or why didn't they try to escape? I will never condemn the ancestors for how they chose to survive an atrocity like slavery, But from the context clues, I think they might not have experienced the worst version of slavery. So they were okay until they were left in the hands of Irene. They realized they were about to be in the sunken place and needed to get out, like that Jordan Peele movie, Get Out. And also, I think sometimes in life you're on a path and there are things you have to do. It's almost like your destiny, so you have to do them. I'm just musing. I don't have to give any answers. I just have to think. On the subject of white women as the oppressed and the oppressor, there's this false equivalency of black women and white women both being similarly oppressed during slavery. But let's talk about Irene. Irene always had the power that came from attaching herself to a white man, whether it was her father, her brother, or husbands. She used that power to oppress a black couple and take their wages and freedom. The only time she was disempowered was when her husband relinquished her right to own them. Even then, Irene made more money from stealing their wages than she would have made had she sold them. Irene was a big-time oppressor. But feel free to think for yourself and tell me what you think. Thank you so much for listening.